His father was dying on his shoulder. A traitor was leading the hunters closer with every passing second. And Orion Steele, the boss of the Steele Holdings empire, the man who made all of Seattle bow, was now standing before a weathered wooden door in the middle of the forest, begging a stranger for help. The massive mastiff watched him through the crack in the door. No barking, no growling, just watching. Those dark brown eyes seemed to be weighing whether the man before them deserved to be saved or left to the darkness. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Orion spoke, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But if you don't open this door in the next 30 seconds, my father won't survive the night." Silence. The forest wind swept through the pine canopy, carrying the chill of autumn and the scent of danger drawing near. Aldrich's labored breathing grew weaker with each passing moment. Then the door latch clicked. Wren Calloway had no idea who she had just opened the door for. She didn't know the blood-soaked man before her controlled an underground empire, didn't know his enemies would burn everything she had built over the past 3 years to the ground, and by the time she found out it was far too late to turn back. If you believe that sometimes saving a stranger can change an entire life, subscribe to the channel, stay with us until the very end of the story, and leave a comment below telling us which moment in the story made it impossible for you to look away. Wren pushed the wide wooden door open a little farther. The glow of the oil lamp from inside spilled across the porch, washing over the two figures standing unsteadily in the mist. She could see them more clearly now. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame solid as if it had been carved from stone. His black suit was smeared with mud and something darker that she didn't want to think about. His face was sharply cut, with a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw. His steel-gray eyes fixed on her without blinking. But in the instant the light touched his pupils, Wren noticed something. Even exhausted to the point that his knees were trembling, that gaze still swept across the room in a split second, marking the position of the windows, judging the distance to the exits, counting the objects that could be used as weapons. This wasn't an ordinary man. This was a man who knew danger as intimately as he knew his own breathing. Slung over his shoulder, the older man hung unconscious. His white hair was plastered down with sweat and mud. His face was pale as paper. The wound in his chest was still seeping through the white dress shirt that had now turned a deep, dark red. His breathing was shallow and rapid, as though every breath were its own battle. Wren stood there for 1 second, only 1 second. For 3 years, she had built a secluded life for herself here. No phone, no internet. No one knew she existed. She had run from the outside world, from painful memories, from the question about Meadow that had never found an answer. She didn't want to get involved with anyone, didn't want to open her door to any kind of trouble. But when she looked at the silver-haired man's wound, she saw something far too familiar. Skin beginning to turn gray, a weak pulse fluttering visibly at the neck, broken, uneven breaths. Death was coming close. She had seen it hundreds of times in the emergency room. And even though she had left all of that behind, the instinct of a nurse never truly disappeared. "Bring him inside," Wren said, surprised by the calm in her own voice. "Lay him on the big wooden table in the middle of the room. Be careful with his head and neck." Orion looked at her for a moment. There was something in his eyes that looked like surprise. She didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't ask who he was or what had happened. She only gave short commands like someone used to directing life and death situations. He stepped over the threshold, lifted his father carefully, and laid him on the oak table that Wren had cleared with one sweep of her hand. Caesar stood by the door, growling low in his throat but not attacking. The giant dog watched every movement the stranger made, muscles taut and ready to lunge at any moment. Wren moved quickly. She pulled a metal box from the wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. When she opened it, inside there weren't adhesive bandages and mercurochrome like an ordinary family first aid kit. Hemostatic clamps, sutures, sterile syringes, professional antiseptic solution, medical gauze in every size. These were the tools of a professional. Orion recognized that at once. "Are you a doctor?" he asked, his voice rough. Wren didn't answer. She was focused on cutting Aldrich's shirt open to reach the wound. When she saw the full extent of the injury, she drew in a deep breath, but her hands didn't shake. The wound was deep, but luckily it didn't seem to have reached the internal organs. He had lost a lot of blood. That was the biggest problem. She began to work, her movements swift and exact, as though she had practiced them thousands of times. Orion stood beside her, his hands clenched tight, his eyes never leaving his father for a single second. He wanted to do something. Anything. But in this field, he was useless. All he could do was stand there and watch the strange woman try to hold on to his father's life. Ren worked in silence for several minutes, then suddenly looked up at Orion. Her eyes swept from head to toe and stopped at the tear in the sleeve of his suit jacket, where the black fabric had been soaked through with something wet. "You're injured too," she said, not asking but stating a fact. "Sit down in that corner before you collapse and give me one more person to worry about." "I'm fine," Orion answered. "You're losing blood and shaking from exhaustion. You'll pass out in 10 minutes if you keep standing." Ren didn't look up, her hands still stitching Aldrich's wound. "Sit down. That's not a suggestion." Orion was about to argue. He was used to giving orders, not taking them, but at that exact moment, his knees buckled. The adrenaline that had kept him upright through 2 hours of running through the forest had finally burned out. He reached for the wall, trying not to fall face first onto the floor. In the end, he sat down in the corner Ren had pointed to, his back against the wooden wall, his eyes still never leaving his father for even a second. Caesar moved and lay down in the space between Orion and the door. The dog wasn't growling anymore, but he was still alert. His dark brown eyes tracked every movement of the stranger, ready to spring if the man made a single suspicious move. In the small room flooded with the warm yellow glow of oil lamps, there was nothing left but the harsh breathing of Aldrich, the sound of metal touching metal as Ren worked, and the wind from the forest slipping through the cracks around the window. Outside, the night was still pitch black, and somewhere in that darkness, the hunters were still following the trail. 2 hours passed like 2 years. Ren worked without stopping, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed these motions thousands of times before. Stopping the bleeding, stitching the wound, checking the pulse, monitoring the breathing. She didn't need to think. Her body moved on its own like a machine programmed to perfection. The oil lamp flickered on the table, throwing restless shadows against the wooden walls, but her hands remained steady as stone. Orion watched from the corner of the room, his back still against the wall, his body drained but his mind sharp enough to catch every detail. He had seen many people treat wounds in his life, doctors hired for staggering sums, back alley healers working in dark, forgotten places. But he had never seen anyone work with the calm of the woman before him. No panic, no hesitation. Every stitch was exact down to the millimeter. This wasn't the skill of an ordinary nurse. This was the hand of someone who had stood at the border between life and death far too many times. "Are you a doctor?" Orion asked when Ren paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Ren didn't look up. She was checking Aldrich's pulse again, counting the beats beneath her fingers. "I used to be an emergency room nurse." Her voice was flat, as though she were speaking about someone else's life. 5 years in the trauma ward at a Seattle hospital. 2 years volunteering in a conflict zone. She paused for one beat, her hand still resting on Aldrich's wrist. "Now I just grow vegetables and talk to the dog." There was something bitter in her voice. Orion caught it at once. She hadn't simply left her job and come back to the countryside to live in hiding. She was running. Running from something bad enough to make someone with skills like hers abandon everything and bury herself in the deep woods. He wanted to ask more, but he knew this wasn't the moment. And she wasn't the kind of person who would open up easily. Another 30 minutes passed. Ren placed the final stitch, cut the thread, and wrapped the wound carefully with a layer of clean gauze. She straightened up, and her spine cracked after so long bent over the table. For the first time since they had come inside, she allowed herself to let out a long breath. Aldrich was still unconscious, but his breathing had grown steadier. The color had returned a little to his skin. His pulse beat with more strength beneath the bandages. "He's going to live," Ren said, her voice tired but certain. "The wound is deep, but luckily it didn't hit any internal organs. Blood loss was the biggest problem, but with rest and proper care, he'll recover." Orion closed his eyes for 1 second. His body suddenly felt heavy, as if someone had just dropped a slab of stone across his shoulders. For the past several hours, he hadn't allowed himself to think about the possibility that his father might not make it. Now, hearing the confirmation that his father would live, all the tension he had held back came crashing down at once. He opened his eyes and looked at Ren as she put away the medical instruments. "Thank you." Ren didn't answer. She only gave a short nod and walked to the sink to clean her hands. Cold water ran over, fingers stained dark red, washing the traces of the long night down the drain. Orion reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, but not a single bar showed in the upper corner. He tried calling. No connection. He tried sending a message. It wouldn't go through. He pulled a smaller device from his pocket. A backup communication unit Reed had prepared for every emergency. He turned it on. The screen flickered. Then it went black. No signal. "This area doesn't get phone service," Ren said from the sink, her back still turned toward him. "That's one of the reasons I chose this place." Orion shook his head slowly. His gray eyes dropped to the device in his hand, then lifted toward the dark window beyond. "This isn't natural signal loss." His voice turned lower. "Someone is jamming communications on purpose. This device was designed to work in any conditions, even in remote wilderness. If it can't get a signal, then someone is using a military-grade jammer somewhere nearby." He shoved the device back into his pocket, his jaw clenching tight. "They wanted to make sure I couldn't call anyone." Ren turned around, drying her hands with a cloth towel. She looked at Orion, her gaze more guarded now than before. "Who are they?" Orion didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, where the night was black as ink, not a single star breaking through the heavy clouds. The wind still moved through the cracks around the door, carrying the cold of late autumn. Somewhere deep in the woods, the people hunting him still hadn't given up. He knew that. "I don't know for certain." His voice finally came, heavy as stone. "But someone inside my organization betrayed us. Only 3 people knew tonight's route. Me, my father." He stopped, swallowing down a name he still didn't want to believe. "And one man I've trusted for 10 years. A heavy silence settled over the room. Ren didn't ask anything more. She understood betrayal, understood the feeling of being stabbed in the back by the person you trusted most. Maybe she understood it more deeply than he realized. Caesar rose from his post by the door. The giant dog walked slowly toward Ren, his claws tapping softly against the wooden floor. He lay down beside her feet, resting his head on her lap, his dark brown eyes still fixed on the door, as if he knew the night was nowhere near over. Ren placed a hand on Caesar's head, her fingers slipping into the thick gray fur. She looked at the stranger sitting in the corner of her cabin, looked at the unconscious old man on the table, and wondered just how much trouble she had stepped into. Outside, the forest wind kept blowing, and the night was still very long, 3 o'clock in the morning. The room was steeped in the pale yellow glow of an oil lamp turned low. Aldrich still lay motionless on the table, but his breathing had become far steadier than it had been when they first arrived. Ren had just finished changing his bandages, checking the stitches one last time before straightening up. He would be all right. At least he would make it through the night. She stepped back a few paces, her eyes shifting to the man seated by the window. Orion wasn't sleeping. From the moment he had sat down against the corner wall until now, he hadn't closed his eyes for even a second. His back rested against the wooden wall, one leg drawn up, the other stretched out, a posture that looked relaxed, but ready to spring to his feet at any moment. On the floor beside his right hand, the kitchen knife Ren had left on the shelf now lay within easy reach. She didn't know when he had taken it. She hadn't heard a sound, but it was there now, its cold steel blade catching the oil lamp's light. Ren watched the way he held the knife when his hand brushed against it without thinking. Natural as breathing, not the way an ordinary person held a knife to chop vegetables or cut meat. This was the grip of someone who had used it as a weapon so many times that it had become instinct. His gray eyes never stopped sweeping the room, passing over the window, the front door, then returning again to where his father lay. Even when he looked as though he were resting, he was still assessing, calculating, planning. She knew this man was dangerous, very dangerous, the kind of dangerous she had learned to recognize after years in a conflict zone, the kind of man who could take a life without hesitation. But she also saw the way he looked at his father. Every time his gaze settled on Aldrich's pale face, something softened in those cold steel eyes. Worry, fear, the kind of thing no one could fake, no matter how good an actor they were. Caesar moved through the room, his claws tapping softly against the wooden floor. The giant dog went from his place beside Aldrich to the front door, then turned and came back again. The guarding instinct bred deep into the blood of a mastiff wouldn't let him rest. He sniffed the air, his ears turning toward the window, then resumed his silent patrol. Ren walked into the small kitchen in the corner of the room and set water to boil on the wood stove, where the embers were still glowing. She made a cup of hot tea, the scent of herbs spreading through the cold air. Then she crossed back to Orion and placed the cup on the floor beside him. He didn't reach for it. He only looked at her, his eyes wary as if he were facing a possible threat. "Aren't you afraid of me?" he asked, his voice low and rough from hours of silence. Ren sat down in the wooden chair across from him, a few steps away. She looked straight into his eyes without flinching. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago," she answered, her voice as calm as if she were talking about the weather. "Fear doesn't save anyone. I learned that." Orion said nothing. That answer touched something inside him, some corner he had buried long ago. This woman wasn't ordinary, not only because of her medical skill or the secluded life she lived in the woods. There was something in her eyes, a familiar darkness he recognized because he carried it in himself. She had seen things no one should have seen. She had lost something that mattered, and she had found a way to keep living even though the wound had never truly healed. Time passed in silence. Ren didn't try to make conversation. Orion didn't try to explain. They simply sat there, each with their own thoughts, while the night kept moving outside the door. Then suddenly Caesar stopped in the middle of his patrol. The giant dog stood still for a moment, his head tilted to one side, as though listening to something human ears couldn't hear. Then he did something that genuinely surprised Ren. Instead of continuing his rounds or lying down by the door at his guard post, Caesar walked slowly toward Orion. The dog looked at him for a moment, his dark brown eyes seeming to weigh him one last time. Then he lay down right beside Orion's feet and rested his head on the man's thigh, letting out a long breath. Ren stared at the sight, unable to hide her astonishment. Caesar had never done that with a stranger. Never. She had adopted this dog from a rescue shelter 4 years ago, and he had come with wounds left by his former owner. He didn't trust people. He didn't allow anyone but her to come close. But now he was lying beside a man they had met only a few hours earlier, as though he trusted him completely. Ren said nothing, but the look in her eyes as she watched Orion had changed. Just a little. Enough for him to notice. Orion looked down at the giant dog leaning against his leg. His hand hesitated for a brief moment, then settled gently on Caesar's head, stroking the wrinkled gray fur. The dog didn't react, only closed his eyes, his body relaxing for the first time since strangers had entered the cabin. Outside the window, the sky was slowly shifting from pitch black to a pale gray. Dawn was coming, but the fog still lay thick over the forest. The tree trunks appeared only as faint ghost-like shapes in the milky white mist. Ren rose to her feet, about to check on Aldrich again, when Caesar suddenly jerked his head up. The dog's ears went rigid. His eyes opened wide, fixed straight toward the forest outside. A low growl began deep in his throat, not loud, but full of warning. Orion was on his feet in an instant, the knife already secure in his hand. He moved toward the window, his eyes scanning through the fog. Ren stood still, her heart beating faster as she followed Caesar's line of sight. She couldn't see anything, only mist and the dark outlines of trees, but she trusted her dog. "They're here." Orion's voice was low and cold, without a trace of hesitation, as if he had always known this would happen, only not when. Caesar kept growling, the low sound rolling up from deep in his chest. The giant dog rose to his feet, all 4 legs planted wide, muscles drawn tight beneath his gray coat. His dark brown eyes never left the milky white fog beyond the window, as if he could see through the invisible veil that human eyes couldn't penetrate. Ren watched her dog, reading every signal in the body language she had learned to understand over 4 years of living with him. The way Caesar's ears kept turning, catching sounds from several directions at once. The way his head shifted from left to right, tracking movements she couldn't see. The way the pitch of his growl changed depending on how near the threat was. At least 5 or 6 people were moving out there, maybe more. And from the way they approached, silent, organized, closing in from several sides, this wasn't a street gang or a pack of amateur thieves. This was a professional formation. Ren didn't panic. That surprised her. After 3 years of living in hiding, she had thought she had forgotten how to face danger. But it turned out her body still remembered. The survival instinct forged during her years in a conflict zone had never truly gone away. It had only been sleeping, waiting to be awakened. She moved quickly toward the wooden cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a layer of old blankets, was the thing she had bought when she first moved here and had never thought she would have to use again. A means of self-defense. She checked it quickly, making sure everything was still ready. Orion watched her from his place by the window. You know how to use that? Ren didn't look up. Live alone in the woods for 3 years and you learn a few things. Her voice stayed even, without the slightest tremor. Either you learn, or you become food for bears. There wasn't time for surprise or questions. The two of them moved as if they had worked together many times before, survival instinct guiding every action. Orion shoved the heavy wooden cabinet in front of the largest window, blocking the view from outside. Ren flipped over the oak table, turning it into a barrier in the middle of the room. She ran to Aldrich, checked his condition quickly, then helped Orion carry him into the small room in back, where there was only one narrow window and thick brick walls. "Caesar," Ren called, her voice clear and firm. The dog ran over at once and stood beside Aldrich in a protective stance. "Stay here. Guard him." Caesar lay down beside the old man, but his eyes remained fixed on the doorway, his ears still standing alert. The muscles beneath his coat stayed taut, ready to launch himself at anyone who dared cross the threshold. Ren looked at Orion. "This dog won't let anyone touch him. Trust me." They had just turned back toward the main room when they heard footsteps. Not one or two, but many, moving at the same time, surrounding the house from every direction. The sound of dry branches snapping beneath boots, the rustle of leaves as men pushed through the undergrowth. They weren't even trying to hide their presence anymore. Then a voice rang out, slicing through the fog and the gray light of dawn. Orion Steele, a man's voice, low and cold, carried through the shut door. "We know you're in there. We know the old man's in there too." Orion stood motionless, his back against the wall beside the window, out of sight from outside. His jaw tightened. He recognized that voice. Every word, every inflection. "Hand over the old man." The voice continued, calm, as if offering a business deal. "You can live through tonight. We don't intend to make things difficult for you, Orion. We only want him," Ren whispered, quiet enough that only Orion could hear. "You know him?" Orion nodded, his gray eyes now cold as ice. "Pierce Donovan, Conrad Ashford's trusted enforcer." He spat the name out like venom. "Ashford wants to swallow my family's business network. My father is the last obstacle." Ren froze where she stood. She had heard that name. Ashford. It went through her like a blade of ice, driving straight into an old wound she had thought had healed. Conrad Ashford. Ashford Financial. The company where Meadow had once worked. The company where her sister had vanished without a trace 6 years ago. Ashford Financial? Her voice shook, utterly unlike the calm she had shown through the entire night. Orion turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing. He caught the change immediately. She didn't just know that name. She was afraid of that name. "You know him?" Ren didn't answer. She couldn't. Her face had gone pale, as if she had just seen a ghost from the past rise before her. The hand holding her means of self-defense trembled slightly, not because of the men surrounding the house outside, but because the name that had just been spoken had dragged her back into the memories she had spent 6 years trying to bury. Meadow. Her sister. Missing after working at Ashford Financial. And now the man behind it all was sending people to hunt the 2 men inside her house. This wasn't coincidence. None of this was coincidence. Outside, Pierce Donovan was still waiting for an answer, and the patience in his voice was beginning to wear thin. 30 seconds, Orion. After that, we come in, and I won't guarantee who survives." 30 seconds passed in taut silence. Then Pierce's voice came one last time, cold and final. "Time's up." The eastern window shattered first. Glass burst outward like a storm of crystal, and a small object flew into the middle of the room, immediately releasing a cloud of thick white smoke that blurred everything from sight. A jamming device. Orion had expected this. He instantly pulled his collar up over his nose, narrowed his eyes, and dropped his body lower. Ren did the same on the other side of the room, covering her face with her sleeve as she backed toward the wall. Without exchanging a single word, they split in opposite directions, survival instinct guiding every step. The first dark figure came through the broken window frame. Orion moved as quickly as night itself, ignoring the wound in his arm that was still seeping blood. He stepped aside, let the attacker lose momentum and lunge forward, then turned. One motion. Precise. Cold. The attacker hit the floor and didn't move again. The second man came right after him, but Orion was already ready. He intercepted him, trapped the arm, twisted, and disabled him in seconds. The skill in close combat was masterful, each movement as though it had been practiced thousands of times until it became pure instinct. This wasn't self-taught skill. This was something trained from childhood, handed down by the best, tested in real situations where life and death were on the line. At the back of the house, Wren held her position. She heard footsteps approaching from the rear door, at least 3 men trying to break in from that side. She stayed calm, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on the wooden door trembling beneath the kicks from outside. When it finally burst open, she was ready. She gave cover from a distance, slowing the attacking group and forcing them to look for shelter instead of rushing straight into the house. Her movements were calm and precise, without panic or hesitation. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had been in worse situations than this. In the back room, an unfamiliar sound broke through. One of the men had found a way in through the small window, slipping past both Orion's and Wren's attention. He landed lightly, his eyes sweeping the dark room in search of his target. Aldrich still lay motionless on the makeshift bed, his breathing even, unaware of the danger drawing near. The intruder moved toward him, one hand extended. He only managed 2 steps. 70 kilograms of muscle crashed into him like a gray storm. Caesar didn't bark, didn't growl a warning. The dog came out of the darkness like a ghost, his jaws locking onto the intruder's arm, his weight driving the man to the floor in an instant. A scream choked off in the man's throat, the sound of struggling, then silence. Caesar let go, stepped back a few paces, and returned to his guarding place beside Aldrich. The dog lay down, his head resting on his front paws, his dark brown eyes still fixed on the doorway, calm as if nothing had just happened. Out in the main room, Orion had already disabled 2 more men. He moved through the smoke as it slowly began to thin, using the confusion to turn it into his advantage. Wren kept supporting him from behind, forcing the attacking group to split their numbers and keeping them from concentrating their assault in one direction. They worked together with a strange, seamless rhythm, as if they had fought side by side many times before, even though this was the first time they had ever stood on the same side. Pierce stood beyond the tree line, watching through the fog. His simple plan had become far more complicated than expected. He had anticipated that Orion would be hard to handle, but he hadn't expected the woman living in the house to be a threat too. And the dog had taken down one of his best men. He looked around, counting how many had already fallen. Too many. Far too much damage for a mission that should have been simple. "Fall back," he ordered, his voice cold but edged with anger. Everybody fall back. The remaining dark figures quickly disappeared into the fog, dragging their injured men with them. Pierce paused at the edge of the forest and turned for one last look toward the house. "This isn't over, Steele." His voice carried back through the freezing air of dawn. "Ashford isn't in a hurry, and he never gives up." Then he vanished into the woods, his shape dissolving into the mist as if he had never been there at all. Silence returned. There was only the wind moving through the shattered window frame and the rough breathing of the 2 people still standing in the middle of the room. Orion leaned back against the wall, his body drained, the wound in his arm now soaking the entire sleeve red. Wren stood a few steps away, her hair in disarray, sweat beading across her face, but her eyes still sharp as they swept the room to make sure no danger remained. The glass was broken everywhere. The furniture was in chaos. The smell of smoke from the jamming device still hung in the air, mixing with the smell of wood and the dampness of the early morning fog. The house she had built over the last 3 years now looked as if it had just come through a storm. Orion looked at her, and there was something different in his expression now from when they had first met. No longer only caution and assessment. There was something closer to respect. "You just saved my life," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Wren turned to look at him, her face still cool, but one corner of her mouth curved very slightly, almost like a mocking smile. "Don't get used to it," she answered. But when their eyes met in the middle of the wreckage, something had changed. She no longer looked at him as though he were only a dangerous stranger to be watched, and he no longer looked at her like a mystery that had to be solved. They had gone through a battle together, and that, whether they wanted it or not, had created an invisible thread between them. A few hours passed in heavy silence. Orion and Wren cleared away the wreckage, covering the shattered windows as best they could with tarps and wooden boards. Aldrich still lay in the back room, his condition stable under Wren's care. Caesar remained on guard, his dark brown eyes never straying from the door. The sun had risen high, yet the fog still hadn't fully burned away, draping the surrounding forest in a milky white veil. Then the sound of engines came from far off, tearing through the stillness. Caesar was on his feet at once, a growl rising in his throat. Orion reached for the knife, his whole body tightening, ready for another attack. But then something strange happened. Caesar's growl stopped. The dog's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster. He recognized someone. 2 black off-road vehicles pulled to a stop in front of the yard. The doors opened, and 2 people stepped out. The first was a tall man with shoulders broad as a doorframe, thick muscle rolling beneath a black leather jacket. His face was angular, his features hard, his hair cut short in a military style. He moved with the confidence and alertness of someone long familiar with danger, his eyes sweeping the area before he came toward the house. The second was a younger woman with dyed red hair cut to her shoulders, black-framed glasses on her face, and a laptop bag in her hand. She looked like a typical tech employee at first glance, but the sharpness in her eyes behind the glasses said she was anything but ordinary. Orion stepped outside, and the broad-shouldered man came at him immediately. He pulled Orion into a fierce embrace, the kind shared by brothers, by comrades who had thought they had lost each other. "I thought you were gone." His voice was low and rough, relief buried inside it and impossible to hide. 12 hours. We spent 12 hours searching everywhere for you." "Reed," Orion answered, clapping the man's back. "I'm still alive." Reed Thornton, 35 years old, former Navy Special Warfare operator, Orion's right hand for years, the one man Orion trusted completely in a world where trust was a luxury. Reed stepped back, his eyes moving over the wound on Orion's arm, over the wrecked house behind him, over the woman and the dog standing in the doorway. "Your father?" he asked. "Inside, badly hurt, but he'll live." Orion nodded toward Wren. Because of her. The red-haired woman had already stepped into the house without waiting for introductions. Nina Volkov, 29 years old, the organization's technology specialist. She had the look of a tech nerd, with her glasses and dyed hair, but underneath it was a computer genius who could break into any system in the world. She knelt beside one of the jamming devices still lying on the floor, turned it over, and examined the serial markings and internal parts. "Military-grade signal jammer," she said in an even voice, as though reading a technical report. "Not cheap. Someone spent a lot of money to make sure you couldn't contact anyone." Orion stepped back inside, with Reed right behind him. "How did you find me?" Nina stood up and adjusted her glasses. "The emergency tracking chip implanted under the skin of your left arm. You activated it before your phone died." She pulled the laptop from her bag and opened it, the screen lighting up with a map and coordinate points. "The signal was very weak because of the jammer, but it was enough for us to narrow down the area. Reed and I spent 12 hours pinpointing the exact location and getting past the roadblocks they set up along the way." "Roadblocks?" Wren spoke for the first time, standing by the doorway to the room where Aldrich lay. Reed nodded, his face dark. "Ashford's people. They sealed off every road leading into this area. We had to cut through the forest." Nina tapped a few keys on the laptop, and the screen shifted to another window. "But that's not the worst part." Her voice dropped lower. "I traced the source of the leaked information. The route for your convoy and your father's last night." She turned the laptop toward Orion. "It came from inside." Orion looked at the screen. An audio file, a message thread, and a name he recognized instantly. "Only 3 people knew the movement plan last night," Nina said slowly. "You, your father, and Garrett Vance." She pressed play. The voice that came from the laptop speakers was clear and unmistakable. Garrett Vance, the man who had worked for the Steele family for 10 years, was speaking with Pierce Donovan, giving him the exact time and route of the convoy, selling Orion and his father to the enemy. Orion stood as still as carved stone. Not a single muscle in his face moved. Not one emotion showed. Only his gray eyes turned darker, deeper, like a bottomless abyss. "Garrett worked for me for 10 years. His voice finally came, rough and slow. 10 years. Reed stood beside him, his jaw tight. Ashford promised him a higher position after the takeover, and $5 million in cash. Orion turned to look at Reed, his gaze sharp as a blade. "He sold my father for $5 million. No one said anything." The room sank into heavy silence. Orion's hand clenched hard at his side, his knuckles turning white from the force of it. Betrayal. It hurt worse than any physical wound. worse than a bullet tearing through flesh, worse than a blade cutting to the bone, because it came from someone you trusted, from someone you had counted as family. Ren stood motionless in the corner of the room, watching everything in silence. She saw Orion, the powerful man who made all of Seattle tremble, reveal real hurt for the first time. The cold steel shell around him had cracked, exposing the man inside, a man who could still feel pain, still know disappointment, still be shattered by betrayal. And she understood that feeling, understood it far too well, because 6 years earlier, she had stood just like that, had felt her own world collapse when she realized that the people who should have protected her were the very ones who had turned away first. Night fell, bringing with it a rare stillness after a day of upheaval. Reed and Nina had settled in the living room, taking turns standing watch. Aldrich still lay in the back room, far more stable now than when he had first arrived, his breathing steady in sleep. The house had been reinforced as best it could for the moment, the shattered windows covered with wooden boards, but the marks of the battle were still everywhere. Ren sat on the wooden steps of the front porch, her eyes lifted to the night sky. Millions of stars glittered against the deep black heavens, and the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. It was something that couldn't be seen in Seattle with its towering buildings and artificial glow. That was one of the reasons she had chosen this place. The star-filled sky reminded her that the world was larger than the pain she carried. Soft footsteps sounded behind her. Orion stepped out and sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them. He didn't say anything at first. He only looked up at the sky the way she was looking. Caesar lay down between them, his head resting on Ren's lap, his dark brown eyes half closed, though his ears still turned, listening to every sound in the night. "You know Ashford," Orion said after a stretch of silence. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I saw your face this morning when you heard his name." Ren didn't look at him. Her hand, which had been stroking Caesar's fur, went still, her fingers threading into the thick gray coat. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the forest wind through the pine branches and the steady chorus of insects in the brush. Orion didn't press her. He simply sat there and waited, his gaze still fixed on the stars. 6 years ago, Ren finally said, her voice as soft as breath, as though speaking any louder would make the painful memories more real. "My sister, Meadow, was working as a junior accountant at Ashford Financial. She had just graduated, full of energy, determined to prove herself." Ren stopped and drew in a trembling breath. Meadow found irregularities in the books, numbers that didn't match, money flowing somewhere no one could explain. She was honest. She couldn't look the other way. She was going to report it. Ren's voice caught. Then one day, she disappeared. No message, no trace, as if she'd never existed. Orion turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes darkening in the night. "The police said Meadow ran away." Ren went on, bitterness seeping into her voice. "They said she wanted to start a new life somewhere else. They said she'd left a letter for the family." She shook her head. "I knew my sister. Meadow would have never done that, never left without a word, never left our mother to worry. But no one believed me. No one wanted to listen." "Your parents?" Orion asked quietly. Ren laughed, a sound with no joy in it at all. "My parents divorced a year after Meadow disappeared. The strain destroyed everything. My mother couldn't bear it. She fell apart, got sick, and died 2 years later. The doctors said it was heart disease, but I knew better. She died from losing Meadow, from not knowing where her daughter was, whether she was alive or dead." She paused, her eyes dropping to Caesar lying still across her lap. "And my father left after my mother died. Didn't say where he was going. Never contacted me again. Maybe he couldn't stand looking at me, because I looked too much like Meadow." A heavy silence settled over them. Orion said nothing. He only listened, letting her speak the things she had buried for years. "I was left alone," Ren said, her voice hollow, with a question that never had an answer. "Where was Meadow? What happened to her? Why couldn't anyone find her?" She lifted her gaze toward the dark forest. "I quit my job, bought this farm with my savings, disappeared from the world, just like Meadow disappeared. I told myself I was searching for peace. But really, I was running from the truth that I'd given up looking for her." Orion listened to every word, his mind fitting the pieces together. Ashford Financial. Irregular books. A young woman discovering something she shouldn't have known. then vanishing without a trace. Too much of a coincidence to be chance. If your sister knew about the irregular books at Ashford, he said slowly. If she had proof of questionable transactions. Wren turned to look at him, and something flashed in her eyes that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 6 years. You think Meadow is still alive? Orion answered in a low, certain voice. Ashford doesn't get rid of people if they still have value. If your sister had important information, if she knew something he needed kept secret, then keeping her alive would have been more useful than the alternative. Hope. It flickered in Wren's eyes like a small flame in the middle of winter. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to think about the possibility that Meadow might still be alive, but hope came hand in hand with terrible fear. If Meadow was alive, where had she been for 6 years? What had she endured? The thought cut through Wren's heart like a blade. I gave up, Wren said, her voice trembling. I ran into the woods and gave up looking for her, while she could have been somewhere out there all this time, waiting for someone to save her. Orion turned to face her fully, his gray eyes locked on hers without blinking. You didn't give up. You were waiting for an opportunity. His voice was firm. And this is that opportunity. Caesar lifted his head and rested his chin on Wren's lap, as though the dog could feel her pain and wanted to comfort her in the only way he knew. Wren stroked his head, her eyes still fixed on Orion. If I help you go against Ashford, she said slowly, what do you promise me? Orion didn't hesitate. I promise I'll find your sister, no matter where she is, no matter what it takes. Moonlight filtered through the pine branches, covering the two of them in a pale silver glow. The forest wind moved past them, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Wren looked into Orion's eyes, searching for lies, searching for the deceit she had learned to recognize after years of being abandoned by the world. But she saw only sincerity. The agreement was sealed not with paper or ink, but with a look. With a promise between two strangers the world had forced onto the same road. The next morning, the first light of day slipped through the cracks of the window that had been temporarily covered with wooden boards, spilling into the small room where Aldrich lay. Orion had been sitting beside the bed since before dawn, his hand wrapped around his father's weathered one, his eyes never leaving the old man's pale face. Then Aldrich opened his eyes, slowly. His heavy lids lifted little by little, revealing gray eyes exactly like his son's, weak, exhausted, but still as sharp as they had been in his youth. Still the eyes of a man who had built an empire from nothing with his own 2 hands. Father. Orion leaned forward, his voice rough with worry and sleeplessness. Can you hear me? Aldrich blinked several times, struggling to focus. Then the corner of his mouth lifted into a faint smile. I hear everything, son. His voice sounded like dry leaves breaking apart, but every word was still clear. Even when I was unconscious, I heard it all. Orion looked at his father and understood that he wasn't only talking about the sounds in the room. Aldrich knew about Garrett, knew about the betrayal, knew about Ashford, and he even knew the story of the woman who had saved his life. Garrett. Orion began, but Aldrich raised a weak hand to stop him. I know. The old man's voice dropped lower, disappointment flickering through his eyes. But that can wait. Right now, bring that girl in here. Wren had been standing outside the door, having already heard that the old man was awake. When Orion turned and looked at her, she stepped inside, with Caesar following behind like a silent gray shadow. She stood beside the bed, unsure what to say to the man whose life she had just wrestled back from death itself. Aldrich looked up at her, his aged gray eyes studying every detail, the brown hair in disarray from too many sleepless nights, the amber eyes carrying the darkness of the past, the slender but sturdy frame of someone used to hard work, and something in her gaze, something he recognized at once because he had once carried it too, a loss that had never truly healed. Come here, child, he said gently, reaching out a weak hand. Wren hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer and knelt beside the bed. Aldrich took her hand, his wrinkled fingers still warm. You saved my life. His voice was so sincere it couldn't be doubted. I don't know who you are, and I don't know why you live alone out here in these woods. But I know one thing. The Steele family never forgets a life debt. Wren didn't say anything. She only looked at the silver-haired old man, feeling the weight of every word he spoke. I heard your story too, Aldrich continued, his voice gentler now. About your sister. About Meadow. He gave her hand a light squeeze. Your sister will be found. I promise you that. with everything I have." Ren looked into his eyes, searching for deception the way she had searched Orion's eyes the night before. And just like the night before, she found only sincerity. This was a man who had built an empire, who had seen the very worst of human nature, and yet had still managed to keep some part of his decency intact. That afternoon, they gathered in the living room. Orion, Ren, Reed, Nina, and even Caesar, stretched out by the door with his ears always standing alert to every sound. Aldrich was still far too weak to sit up, but he insisted on hearing everything through the open door. Nina opened her laptop, and the screen cast satellite images and complex schematics across the wooden wall. "Ashford keeps everything important in one place," she began, her fingers tapping across the keyboard. "A private island off the coast of Seattle. On paper, it's a luxury resort. In reality, it's where he stores all his secrets, financial data, transaction records, and possibly the people he wants hidden from the world." Ren lifted her head, her heart beating faster. The people he wanted hidden. "Meadow, highest level security," Nina continued, pointing to the schematics on the wall. "Guards, cameras, the most advanced alarm systems available. But nothing is without a weakness." She looked at Orion. "Their electrical system depends on generators on the island. If I can get into their network, I can cripple the whole system for a short window." Reed nodded, his arms folded across his chest. "Long enough to get in, pull the data, and get back out." Orion rose and walked toward Ren. He looked at her, his expression serious. "You can stay here with my father. That's a lot safer than coming with us." Ren stood up straight and faced him. For 6 years, she had been running. For 6 years, she had hidden herself in these woods, trying to forget the unanswered question that haunted her about Meadow. But now the chance stood right in front of her. A chance to find the truth, to find her sister, to face the past instead of running from it. "I've hidden long enough," she answered, her voice firm and without a trace of hesitation. Caesar rose to his feet beside her, as if he too were confirming his mistress's decision. The alliance had been formed. 4 people with different reasons, but the same goal, and Ashford's Island was waiting for them. Nina projected the detailed map onto the wall, and the satellite image showed a small island lying off the Seattle coast, about 20 minutes from the mainland by speedboat. The island was lush with trees, with a white mansion standing at its center, surrounded by carefully trimmed gardens and a private helicopter pad. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than a lavish retreat for the super-rich, but Nina zoomed in and pointed to a structure buried deep underground, hidden beneath the basement of the main mansion. "The underground data vault," she said, her fingers tapping against the keyboard. "This is where Ashford stores everything important. Financial records, secret transactions, and from what I've found, files on the people he wants hidden from the world too." Ren felt her heart tighten at those words. Meadow. Her sister could be among the people hidden there, Nina continued, her voice even, as if she were reading from a technical report. "The security system is serious. Around 20 guards, rotating in shifts 24 hours a day. Surveillance cameras covering every corner, motion sensors, electronic fencing. If a bird flies across the wrong section, they'll know." She paused and adjusted her glasses. "But no system is perfect." Reed leaned forward, his arms still folded across his chest. "What's the weak point?" Nina smiled for the first time since arriving, a confident smile from someone who knew she was holding the winning card. "The power system. The whole island depends on its own generators. It's not connected to the mainland grid, which means if I can get into their control network, I can cripple the entire system for about 10 minutes. She looked at Orion. 10 minutes with no cameras, no sensors, no alarms. Long enough to get in, take what we need, and get out. Orion nodded slowly, his mind already breaking down every detail. "What's the exact plan?" Nina pulled up a new window on the screen. "I'll hack the system remotely and cut the power at the scheduled moment. You and Reed go in from the eastern side of the island, where the fewest guards are stationed. The target is the underground data vault. Download everything you can, especially files related to financial transactions and the list of people being held. Then get out before the system comes back online." "What about me?" Ren asked, her voice calm but firm. Orion turned toward her. "You stay here. Get medical supplies ready in case we come back injured. This isn't your fight." Ren rose to her feet and faced him without taking a single step back. "Meadow is my sister. This is exactly my fight. Orion was about to object, but Reed spoke first. Do you have real experience? His tone wasn't challenging, only the plain question of a man who needed to assess a teammate before stepping into a battlefield. Ren didn't answer with words. She only looked at Reed, her amber eyes sharp and steady. The eyes of someone who had seen death too many times to fear it now. The eyes of someone who had stood in the middle of bombs and screaming, and still kept her hand steady enough to save lives. Reed held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod of acceptance. All right, you come with us. Nina continued assigning roles. I'll stay here with Aldrich and run everything remotely. Caesar will guard us. The dog lifted his head when he heard his name, his dark brown eyes turning toward Ren as though asking for permission. Ren gave him a slight nod, and Caesar lay back down, accepting the assignment. When? Orion asked. Tomorrow night, Nina answered. New moon. The thickest darkness we'll get, and I need time to finish breaking into their system. The meeting ended. Everyone scattered to prepare for the mission. Reed checked the gear. Nina bent over her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Ren organized the medical bag, making sure it held everything needed for any situation. But as Orion turned to leave the room, Aldrich's weak voice came from the room beside them. Orion, come here. Orion stepped inside and knelt beside his father's bed. Aldrich took his son's hand, his wrinkled fingers still gripping with the last of their strength. Son, the old man said, his voice trembling, if something happens to me. Don't say that. Orion cut in, his voice thick with emotion. But Aldrich shook his head. Let me speak. I've lived long enough to know nothing is certain. He looked at his son, his old gray eyes full of love. This network, this empire, it doesn't matter as much as people do, son. Never forget that. Don't become the thing I once feared most. Orion nodded, his throat tightening too much for words. The old man smiled and stroked his son's hand one last time before closing his eyes to rest. And Orion stayed there a while longer, looking at his father, memorizing every line in his face, every strand of silver hair, as though he feared this might be the last time. The final night at the farm. The house lay in silence, broken only by the soft wind moving through the pine branches and the steady chorus of insects out in the woods. Reed had fallen asleep in the living room, though even in sleep his posture remained alert, as if he could spring awake at any moment. Nina had drifted off over her laptop, the screen still glowing with lines of code running endlessly, her fingers long since still. Aldrich slept peacefully in the back room, his breathing steadier now than it had been in the days before. Only Orion and Ren were still awake. They sat on the wooden steps of the porch, just as they had sat on that first night when she told him about Meadow. The night sky stretched wide above them, millions of stars glittering like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The Milky Way arched overhead, a river of light no one ever gets to see in the great cities. Caesar lay between them, his head resting on Ren's lap, his dark brown eyes half closed, though his ears still turned faintly, listening to every sound in the night. Neither of them spoke for a long while. There was only the whisper of wind through the leaves, Caesar's steady breathing, and the easy silence between two people who were no longer strangers. Ren tilted her head back to look at the sky, her fingers absently stroking Caesar's fur. Are you afraid? She asked softly, without turning to look at him. About tomorrow. Orion didn't answer at once. He was looking up at the sky, too, his gray eyes reflecting the scattered light of the stars. Of course I am, he finally said, his voice low and honest. Anyone who says they aren't afraid before walking into danger is either lying or out of their mind. He paused for a beat. But I've learned how to act even while I'm afraid. Fear doesn't mean you stop. Ren gave a faint nod. Me too. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She had been afraid of many things in her life. Afraid of losing Meadow. Afraid of never finding the truth. Afraid of facing the past. But she had learned that fear doesn't disappear. It just becomes part of you. And somehow you have to learn how to carry it and keep walking anyway. Orion turned to look at her. In the soft, dim light of the stars, her face seemed gentler, less guarded than it had the first time they met. Her brown hair fell loose over her shoulders, and her amber eyes were fixed on some distant place, as if she were looking at something only she could see. He realized he was looking at her differently now, not with the eyes of a man assessing an ally, not with the gaze of someone searching for weakness, but with the eyes of a man who wanted to protect, wanted to shield. Wanted to make sure nothing terrible ever happened to her. "You're not what I thought you were," he said, his voice softer than usual. Ren turned to look at him, one brow lifting slightly. "And what did you think I was?" Orion was silent for a moment, searching for the right words. "Someone running away. Someone who had given up," he answered honestly. "Someone who locked herself away in the woods because she couldn't face the outside world." Ren didn't seem offended. She only looked at him, her expression calm. "And now?" Orion didn't answer with words. He only looked at her, his gray eyes deep and unreadable, and in that look was an answer words could never fully hold. She wasn't someone running away. She was someone who had fallen and gotten back up. Someone carrying wounds who still knew how to heal others. Someone who had lost everything and still hadn't let go of hope. Caesar suddenly lifted his head and looked at Orion, then at Ren, as if the dog could sense that something was changing between them. His tail wagged slowly, a gentle movement rarely seen in a dog who was so often on guard. Then he lowered his head again and closed his eyes, as if satisfied with what he had just witnessed. The sky in the east was beginning to change color. The deep black faded into gray, then into the faintest blush of pink from the coming dawn. Time was up. Their last peaceful night had passed. Tomorrow, no, today, they would step into enemy territory. Orion rose to his feet, his body stiff after sitting motionless for so many hours. He held out a hand to Ren, his palm turned upward, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than words. "Ready?" Ren looked at his hand for a moment. Then she took it and let him pull her to her feet. "Ready." Their hands stayed clasped, warm in the chill of the early morning air, and neither of them hurried to let go. 1 second, 2 seconds. Longer than it took to help someone stand, but neither of them said anything about that. Caesar got up, stretched, then padded back into the house ahead of them, leaving the two of them standing on the porch, their hands still joined, watching the sunrise spread across the horizon. A moonless night. The sky was black as ink. Not a single star able to break through the thick blanket of clouds rolling in from the sea. The rubber boat skimmed smoothly across the water, its electric motor making almost no sound at all. Reed held the tiller, his eyes fixed on the island slowly taking shape in the darkness ahead. Orion sat at the bow, his body taut, his gaze sweeping the shoreline. Ren sat between them, the medical bag strapped tightly to her back, her heart pounding fast but her hands steady. None of them noticed the large, silent shadow curled tightly in the stern of the boat, hidden beneath a black tarp. Caesar had refused to be left behind. All three of them were dressed in black from head to toe, their faces darkened with camouflage cream, blending into the night like ghosts. Nina's voice came through the earpieces, even and professional. "You're 100 meters from the eastern shore. That's the only blind spot in their camera system. Land there." Reed adjusted their course, guiding the boat toward a narrow patch of rocks hidden behind a jagged outcrop that jutted into the sea. The boat touched land, and all three jumped out, moving quickly into the shadows of the trees. Nina spoke again, her voice carrying a little more tension now. "The system goes down in 60 seconds. You have 10 minutes from the moment the power cuts. Don't waste a second. 60 seconds. Orion counted in his head, his eyes on the estate ahead. The lights were still on, the cameras were still turning. The guards were still walking their fixed routes. 40 seconds. 30 seconds. 20 seconds. Then all at once, everything went dark. The lights died. The cameras stopped. Darkness swallowed the island whole. Nina's voice came through, sharp with satisfaction. "The system is crippled. Your 10 minutes start now. Go." They moved like shadows, fast and silent. Over the fence in darkness, around guards thrown into confusion by the sudden blackout. Toward the main mansion, Reed went first, his Navy special warfare training letting him move without a sound. 2 guards stood at the back entrance, their flashlights slicing through the dark as they tried to understand what was happening. Reed came up behind them and disabled both men in seconds with chokeholds, lowering them to the ground so quietly that hardly a sound was made. Orion led the way down to the basement, the concrete stairs dropping deep beneath the ground, the air turning colder and damper with every step. Ren followed behind him, the small flashlight clipped to her shirt pocket casting a thin beam ahead. At the bottom of the stairs, a massive steel door emerged from the dark. Under normal conditions, it would have been locked by an electronic system, but now, with the power cut, it was nothing more than a heavy slab of metal. Orion and Reed pushed together, and the door slowly opened. The underground data vault. Hundreds of screens arranged in rows, all of them dark from the blackout. Servers stood in lines like giant steel cabinets, their status lights dead. But Nina had prepared for that. The main server has its own backup power, she said through the earpiece. Find the largest unit in the corner with a blinking green light. Orion found it. One server larger than all the others, a green light blinking faintly in the dark. He plugged in the flash drive Nina had given him. A small display on the server lit up, and the download began. 10%, 25%, 40%. Reed stood guard by the door, his whole body rigid, his eyes never leaving the staircase leading back up. Nina counted down the remaining time in their ears. 7 minutes, 6 minutes, 30 seconds. Ren didn't stay still. She moved among the dark screens, her eyes scanning the few machines still showing anything under backup power. Financial files, transactions, lists of names. Then she stopped. Her heart seemed to stop with her. On one small monitor, a familiar name flashed past. Meadow Calloway. She froze in place, her fingers trembling as they touched the screen. The file opened. Her sister's image appeared. Meadow. But not the Meadow she remembered. The woman in the photograph looked so much older than 6 years should have made her. Thin. Hollowed out. Eyes empty. Like someone who had lost part of her soul. Like someone who had lived in darkness so long she'd forgotten what light even looked like. Ren scrolled down, searching for more information. Then she saw it. Detention location. Level B2, room 7. On this island. Right beneath where she was standing. She's here. Ren's voice shook. Meadow is here. Right now. Right under our feet. Orion turned to look at her, then looked at the download screen. 85%. Nina's voice came through with warning. 4 minutes. You need to get out now. We don't have time, Orion said, his voice tight. Ren looked at him, and now her eyes weren't the eyes of the calm ally he had come to know. They were the eyes of a sister who had searched 6 years for the girl she loved, and now knew she was only steps away. I'm not leaving without my sister. The download progress jumped to 100%. Complete. Orion pulled the flash drive free just in time. And at that exact moment, the lights came back on. The power had been restored. The alarm began to scream, a piercing sound tearing through the silence. They had been detected. Orion made the decision in a split second. Reed, take the data to the boat. Wait for us at the extraction point. If we're not out in 15 minutes, go. Reed started to argue, but one look at Orion's face told him the decision was final. He gave one sharp nod, took the flash drive, and vanished into the shadows. Orion turned to Ren. Level B2. Let's go. They ran toward the staircase leading even deeper underground, the alarm shrieking behind them, the sound of pursuing footsteps coming closer with every second. The staircase, leading down to level B2, was narrow and dark, with red emergency lights flashing along the walls, casting ghostly streaks of light through the shadows. The alarm was still screaming above them, and the sound of footsteps and shouted orders echoed down after them. Orion ran in front, Ren right behind him, both moving as fast as they could without making too much noise. Level B2 was a long corridor lined with steel doors on both sides, each one marked with a number. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3. Ren counted in her head, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Room 4, Room 5, Room 6, then they stopped. Room 7. At the end of the hall, a heavy steel door with an electronic lock blinking red. Orion pulled out the device Reed had given him before they split up, a compact electronic lock breaker. He attached it to the control panel beside the door, his fingers moving quickly across the buttons. A beep, a processing sound. The red light turned green. The lock clicked open. Orion shoved against the heavy steel door, and it slowly swung inward with the shriek of metal. The room was smaller than Ren had imagined. The ceiling was low. The concrete walls were bare. Weak light came from a single bulb hanging overhead. There was no window. No furniture except a narrow iron bed in a corner sectioned off to serve as a toilet. And in the corner of the room, curled in on herself like a wounded animal, was a woman. Long black hair hung in tangled strands, covering most of her face. Her body was so thin that her shoulder bones pushed sharply against the thin fabric of her clothes. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring into nothing, as if she hadn't even noticed anyone enter the room. Ren froze in the doorway. She recognized that woman instantly, even after 6 years. Even though she had changed so much, she was almost impossible to recognize. The shape of her face, the way she sat folded into herself, the small birthmark behind her left ear that Ren had seen thousands of times when they were children, every time she brushed her sister's hair. Meadow. Meadow. Ren ran to her sister and dropped to her knees in front of her, her hands gripping those frail shoulders. Meadow, it's me. It's me. Look at me. Meadow lifted her head slowly, as if even that simple movement demanded enormous effort. The eyes that had once been bright and full of life, the eyes Ren remembered smiling at her every morning, were now empty as a dried well. No recognition, no emotion, only the endless emptiness of someone who had lived in darkness far too long. Ren? Meadow's voice was rough and brittle, like dry leaves breaking apart, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone in years. And maybe that was true. Ren couldn't hold back anymore. Tears spilled down as she threw her arms around her sister and pulled that fragile body close. I'm sorry. She choked on the words, each one cutting through her heart. I'm sorry, Meadow. I looked for you everywhere. I didn't give up. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. But Meadow didn't respond. Her body stayed stiff inside her sister's arms, not hugging back, not crying, not saying a word, like a broken doll. 6 years of isolation. 6 years without seeing sunlight. 6 years without being touched by anyone except the people guarding her. It had left wounds no one could see, wounds that might never fully heal. Orion stood at the door, watching the hallway. The footsteps were getting closer from the staircase. They didn't have much time left. Ren, he said, his voice urgent but not harsh. We have to go. Right now. Ren tried to pull Meadow to her feet, but her sister had no strength left. Her legs gave way beneath her, her body limp as cloth. 6 years without going outside had wasted her muscles away until she no longer had the strength to stand on her own. Orion didn't hesitate. He stepped into the room and gently but decisively lifted Meadow into his arms, one hand beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, carrying her the way a child might be carried. Meadow didn't resist, didn't react. She simply lay there in his arms, her eyes still empty, staring into nothing. I'll carry her, Orion told Ren. You go first and clear the way. They ran out of the room and sprinted for the stairs. Reed's voice burst through the earpiece, tight with tension. The main exit is blocked. At least 10 men. You can't get out that way. Nina came in right after him. North Dock. Go through the gardens, cut across the trees, and you'll reach the small pier. I'm bringing the boat there now. 3 minutes. Ren led the way, racing down the corridor in the opposite direction, searching for another route out. Orion followed behind her, Meadow in his arms so frighteningly light, as if she were nothing but skin and bone. The alarm kept screaming. Orders were being shouted from every direction, but they kept running, carrying with them a fragile hope, carrying the woman the world had forgotten for 6 long years, carrying the promise that they were going to bring her home. They ran through the dark garden, cut across the thin stretch of trees, and headed for the North Dock. Orion still carried Meadow in his arms, his stride steady despite her weight. Ren ran beside him, her eyes sweeping through the darkness for danger. Reed had rejoined them at the edge of the garden, and now he ran ahead, clearing the way, his special operations training allowing him to spot and avoid the guards searching everywhere. The alarm still screamed behind them, flashlight beams slicing wildly through the trees, but they were getting closer to the dock. Escape was within reach. Then suddenly, a giant gray shape burst out of the darkness and charged straight toward them. Ren almost screamed in terror, but then she recognized him. Caesar. The 70-kilogram mastiff was tearing toward her like madness itself, his dark brown eyes flashing in the night. Nina's voice came through the earpiece, panicked. Ren, I've lost track of Caesar on the sensors. He must have jumped off the boat when you landed. He's been shadowing you this whole time. Caesar reached Ren, rubbed his head once against her leg, then instantly turned and planted himself in front of her and Meadow, in a protective stance, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The dog had scented something, and only seconds later, Ren saw it too. Pierce Donovan stepped out from the shadows of the trees, 5 men behind him. They blocked the path to the dock, weapons in hand, their expressions cold. Pierce looked at the group before him, a chill smile spreading across his mouth. Did you really think you'd get out? He asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. Ashford knew you'd take this way. How stupid do you think we are? Orion gently set Meadow down against the base of a tree. Then he straightened and stepped forward, placing himself between Pierce's men and the people behind him. His shoulders were squared, his eyes cold, his whole body radiating the kind of authority that didn't need words. "Reed, get them out," he said, his voice low and absolute. "I'll hold them here." Wren stepped up beside him, her eyes never leaving the enemy. "I'm not leaving you behind." There was no time to argue. Pierce gave the signal, and his men rushed forward. Orion met the first one head-on and dropped him with a precise blow to the throat. Reed took on 2 others, his training giving him the advantage even against bad odds. Pierce stayed back, watching, waiting for the right moment. Caesar kept growling, standing in front of Wren and Meadow without moving a single step. The dog knew his duty: protect them, no matter what. In the middle of the chaos, one attacker broke through the line. He wasn't aiming for Orion or Reed. He came straight at Wren, his arm raised high, the flash of metal glinting in the dark. Wren saw him too late. She had no time to react. She only caught the sight of his body lunging toward her and braced for the blow. But the blow never reached her. 70 kilograms of muscle slammed into the attacker from the side. Caesar came out of nowhere like a gray ghost, his massive body knocking Wren out of the line of danger. Dog and attacker collided in midair, the heavy impact cracking through the night. Then both hit the ground. The attacker didn't move again, but neither did Caesar. "Caesar!" Wren screamed and threw herself toward him. She dropped to her knees beside the dog, her shaking hands touching the gray fur. Caesar lay on his side, one hind leg motionless, a terrible wound in his shoulder leaking something dark in the shadows. He tried to lift his head and look at her, his dark brown eyes full of pain and yet still full of love, as if he wanted to say, "I protected you. I did my job." Then his head fell back to the ground. His breathing weakened, one breath at a time. His eyes slowly drifted shut. "No, no, no," Wren cried out, tears streaming down her face as she gathered the dog into her arms. The dog who had stayed beside her for 4 years. The dog who had saved her from loneliness, who had guarded her every night, who had loved her without condition when the whole world turned its back on her. "Don't leave me, Caesar, please don't leave me." Orion turned, and what he saw cracked something inside him. Wren, the strong woman who hadn't broken in front of anything, was now on her knees in the dirt, clutching her dog and crying as if the whole world were collapsing. And maybe, for her, it was. He ran to her and dropped beside her. Pierce and his men had already been dealt with by Reed, but Orion didn't care. Not now. He pressed a hand to Caesar's chest and felt for it. Weak, very weak, but still there. "He's still breathing, Wren," he said, his voice urgent. "Do you hear me? He's still breathing." Wren looked up, her eyes drenched with tears, her face streaked with mud and grief. "Are you sure?" Orion grabbed her hand and held it tight. "I'm sure. His heart is still beating. But we have to move now. He needs treatment," Reed's voice shouted from the dock. "The boat is here. Move now." Orion rose and carefully but quickly lifted Caesar into his arms. The dog was heavy, but he didn't care. Wren helped Meadow to her feet and guided her toward the dock. They ran, carrying 2 fragile lives with them, running toward the waiting boat, running toward the thin, desperate hope that it still wasn't too late. The speedboat tore across the water in the dark, its engine roaring at full power. Reed held the wheel, his eyes fixed on the mainland slowly emerging through the night. Behind him, Wren was on her knees on the floor of the boat, both hands trying to stop Caesar's bleeding with everything she had. She had ripped her own jacket into strips for makeshift bandages, pressing them hard against the wound in the dog's shoulder, trying to keep him from losing any more blood. Caesar lay motionless, his breathing weak, his chest rising so faintly that she had to look carefully just to see it. But he was still alive, still fighting. Meadow lay curled in the corner of the boat, covered by Orion's jacket. Her eyes were open, staring up at the night sky, but as if she saw nothing, as if she had drifted away from reality and was floating inside a world of her own that no one else could reach. Orion pulled out the communications device and dialed Nina. "Nina, we're on our way back. Get an emergency veterinarian ready for Caesar and—" His voice broke off mid-sentence. Silence came from the other end. No answer from Nina, only a faint hiss of static, then a long breath. Then a voice spoke. Not Nina's. A man's voice, deep, warm, and so polite it was chilling. "Orion, Steele. It's been too long." Orion went still for a fraction of a second. He recognized that voice immediately, He had heard it in business meetings, at parties among Seattle's elite, in threats wrapped in sugar. Conrad Ashford. Ashford, Orion said, his voice turning cold as ice. The one and only, Ashford replied, his tone still calm, as though they were discussing the weather. First of all, I should thank you. Thank you for leading me to the place where your father has been resting, a farm in the middle of the woods, truly an excellent hiding place. If it hadn't been for your tracking chip transmitting, I would have never found it. Orion felt his heart clench hard inside his chest. The tracking chip, the same device that had helped Reed and Nina find him, had now led Ashford straight to Wren's farm, straight to where his father was lying. Your old man and your little hacker are sitting here with me right now, Ashford continued, his voice light, almost amused. They're both safe, for the moment. If you touch a single hair on my father's head, Orion growled, his voice filled with the kind of fury he almost never let show. Ashford laughed, soft and well-mannered. Orion, I'm a businessman, not a savage. I have no intention of harming anyone. I only want one thing. He paused for a beat. The data you took from my island. Bring it to my penthouse in Seattle, in exchange for your father and the hacker. It's really that simple. It's a trap, Reed said from the wheel, loud enough for Orion to hear. Obviously a trap. I know, Orion answered, his eyes still fixed on the Black Sea. Wren looked up from Caesar, her eyes red from crying but still sharp. You can't go in there alone. That's suicide. Orion looked at her, then down at Caesar breathing weakly beneath her hands, then at Meadow curled in the corner of the boat. Two fragile lives that needed immediate care. Caesar needs surgery right away if he's going to live, he said, his voice low and heavy. Meadow needs to be taken to a hospital and examined. You have to stay with them. But, Wren started to protest. Wren, Orion cut her off, but his voice wasn't harsh, only tired and honest. You found your sister. You kept your promise to yourself. Now let me keep my promise to you. He looked at her, his gray eyes deep and unguarded. I'll bring my father back, and I'll finish this. Wren wanted to say something, wanted to argue, wanted to grab hold of him and keep him from going. But when she looked down at Caesar struggling to breathe under her hands, when she looked at Meadow lying there like a broken doll, she understood. She couldn't leave them, couldn't abandon them. All right, she finally said, her voice catching. But you have to come back. Do you hear me? You have to come back. Orion looked at her and didn't answer with words. He only gave one slow, certain nod. Reed spoke up. I'm going with you. No, Orion said, his tone final, leaving no room for argument. Stay and protect them. That's an order. The boat hit the dock. On the pier, a veterinary emergency vehicle was already waiting, its red and blue lights flashing in the night. Nina had managed to make the call before she was taken. The medical team rushed forward, lifting Caesar onto a stretcher and quickly assessing his condition. Another ambulance pulled in for Meadow. Everything happened fast, chaotic but organized. Orion stood on the dock, watching Wren run beside Caesar's stretcher. She turned back to look at him once, her eyes holding 1,000 things she couldn't say. Then she disappeared into the ambulance. He stood there for 1 second longer, watching after her. Then he turned and stepped into the darkness of Seattle, heading toward the tallest tower in the city where Conrad Ashford was waiting. Conrad Ashford's penthouse sat at the very top of the tallest skyscraper in Seattle. The private elevator opened, and Orion stepped into a space where luxury declared itself in every corner. Every wall had been replaced with reinforced glass, offering a sweeping view of the city glittering below, like a vast carpet of light stretching all the way to the horizon. Leather and rare wood furniture, fine art hanging everywhere. A long bar lined with bottles of expensive liquor. This was the home of a man at the head of an empire, and Ashford wanted everyone to know it from the very first moment they walked in. Orion had come alone, unarmed, exactly as Ashford demanded. He had left everything behind, carrying only the flash drive with the data tucked inside his inner jacket pocket. 2 guards searched him carefully before allowing him into the main living room. Conrad Ashford sat in a black leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of red wine in his hand, as though he were welcoming an honored guest for dinner, instead of standing in the middle of a confrontation that could end in blood. He looked about 55 years old, with platinum hair combed neatly back, a handsome face touched with aristocratic refinement, and the sort of courteous smile that had fooled thousands of people over decades. But his green eyes were cold as a reptile's. Behind Ashford, Aldrich sat in a wheelchair, both hands tied to the armrests. The old man looked exhausted, his wound not yet fully healed, but his gray eyes were still bright and sharp when they found his son. Nina stood in the corner of the room, held tight under the watch of 2 guards. But there was no fear on her face, only anger at having let herself get caught. "Father," Orion said, and his voice softened only when he looked at the old man. "Are you all right?" Aldrich gave a faint laugh, weary but still proud. "I've been through far worse, son. Don't worry about me." Ashford rose and walked toward Orion with the wineglass still in his hand. Touching, really. A Steele family reunion. His voice was smooth, but thick with mockery. "You're like your father, Orion. Stubborn to the point of stupidity. If he'd agreed to sell me the port 5 years ago, we wouldn't be standing here today." Orion said nothing. He only looked at Ashford with eyes as cold as ice. Ashford continued, swirling the wine in his glass. "The Steele family's port was the last piece I needed. Control that, and I control the entire Northwest shipping route. From Seattle to Vancouver. From Vancouver to Alaska. Everything passes through my hands." He paused and took a sip of wine. "But your father refused. You refused. Both of you were too foolish to understand that refusing me was never an option. So you thought kidnapping would change that?" Orion asked, his voice unnaturally calm. Ashford laughed. "I don't need your agreement. Garrett Vance already signed the transfer papers in your place. Legal and complete. By the time you realized it, the port would have already belonged to me." Orion was silent for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a strained smile. Not a bitter twist of the mouth. But a cold, confident smile. The smile of a man holding the one card his enemy never saw coming. Ashford stopped with the glass halfway to his lips, his green eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you smiling at? Did you really think I came here empty-handed?" Orion asked, his tone light, as if they were discussing nothing more serious than the weather. "Did you really think I was foolish enough to walk into a tiger's den without a plan?" Ashford went still, and suddenly the wineglass in his hand seemed heavier than before. "Garrett Vance was arrested by the FBI 2 hours ago," Orion said, each word clear and sharp. "Every document he signed is worthless now. He's giving them everything in exchange for a lighter sentence." He paused, letting the truth settle in. "And the data I took from your island? It's not here with me. It's already on its way to every major newsroom in Seattle, to the FBI, to the IRS, to every person you've spent 20 years trying to keep your secrets from." Ashford froze. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at it. Notifications flooded the screen. Messages, missed calls, alerts, news broadcasts already running. His name was everywhere. The empire he had spent decades building was collapsing in front of his eyes. "No!" Ashford roared, his polished face twisting into rage. He hurled the wineglass against the wall, and it shattered, red wine running down the glass like blood. Then he pulled something from inside his jacket and aimed it straight at Orion. "If I go down, you're coming with me." But he had forgotten one person. With the last of his strength, Aldrich shoved his wheelchair forward with his foot. The chair rolled hard and struck Ashford's legs, throwing him off balance. Orion didn't miss the chance. He lunged, grappling with Ashford, trying to wrench the weapon out of his hand. The 2 men crashed to the floor, struggling as furniture toppled around them. Then came the sound of the doors being forced open. The FBI flooded into the penthouse, flashlights and shouted commands filling the room. "FBI! Everybody down!" Ashford was restrained within seconds. 2 agents pinned him to the floor, handcuffs locked behind his back. He still fought them, his eyes red with fury, glaring at Orion with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Steele. It never is." Orion got to his feet and brushed the dust from his jacket. He watched Ashford being taken away, then turned and untied his father. Aldrich caught his son's hand and squeezed it hard. "You did well," the old man said, his voice weak but full of pride. In the distance, Pierce Donovan and the rest of Ashford's men were being taken into custody too, handcuffed and marched out of the penthouse. Conrad Ashford's dark empire, built on lies and crime over 20 years, had fallen in a single night. When Ashford was led away and the penthouse finally fell quiet, Orion dropped to his knees beside his father's wheelchair. For the first time in days, after everything that had happened, he let himself be weak. He rested his head in his father's lap, the way he had when he was a small boy, when he was afraid, when he needed somewhere safe. Aldrich placed a wrinkled hand on his son's head and gently stroked his dark hair. "You did well," the old man said, his voice frail but full of pride. "I'm proud of you. Your mother would have been proud too." Nina was untied, and she rubbed at her reddened wrists. But the first thing she asked wasn't about herself. "Caesar? Ren? Where are they? What happened on the island?" Orion lifted his head, and all at once he remembered. Caesar, the injured dog, Ren at the veterinary hospital. He pulled out his phone and called Reed. The line rang twice before Reed answered. "Orion, you need to get to the veterinary hospital. Right now." Orion's heart seemed to stop. "Caesar?" Reed was silent for a moment, and the silence stretched like torture. Then he spoke, his voice low and exhausted. "He's in surgery. Has been for 3 hours." Orion didn't need to hear anything else. He made sure the FBI had his father under protection and on the way to a hospital safely. Then he ran outside and got into the waiting car. Seattle's streets were nearly empty in the late-night hours, but to him, every red light felt endless, every passing minute an agony. The veterinary hospital stood on the edge of the city, a 2-story building with a bright sign lit all night long. Orion stepped inside, still wearing the same black suit from the penthouse, his hair disheveled, his eyes red from exhaustion. The receptionist looked at him with surprise, but he didn't stop to explain. He walked straight into the waiting area and saw her immediately. Ren was curled up on a plastic chair, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to keep from shattering. Her eyes were swollen red from crying and lack of sleep. Caesar's dried blood was still on her hands, and she hadn't even bothered to wash it away. Reed sat a few chairs away, silent and watchful. Meadow had already been taken to another hospital for a full examination. Orion walked over and sat down beside Ren. She lifted her face to look at him, her amber eyes filled with worry and exhaustion. "They're trying to save him," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been so long. They won't tell me anything." Orion didn't know what he could possibly say to comfort her. He simply reached out, took her small hand in his, and held it gently. Ren didn't pull away. She let him hold on, as if that hand were the only thing keeping her from sinking under. Time passed like torture. Every minute dragged out like an hour. The clock on the wall ticked, its steady sound like a heartbeat. Ren looked down at the hand holding Orion's, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "He threw himself in front of me. He didn't think about himself at all." Tears spilled over again, tracing down her cheeks. "I didn't deserve him. I spent 3 years hiding from the world, and he still stayed with me, still loved me without conditions." Orion tightened his hold on her hand. "That's loyalty," he said, his voice low and sincere. "The purest kind in the world. It doesn't ask for anything, it doesn't judge, and it doesn't walk away. Caesar knew you deserved that. He always knew." Ren said nothing. She only cried quietly, letting the tears come. Then the surgery door opened. A middle-aged woman in blue scrubs stepped out, her face tired but a faint smile touching her lips. Ren jumped to her feet so fast that she squeezed Orion's hand hard enough to hurt. "Caesar?" she asked, her voice shaking. The doctor nodded. "He's alive." Ren sucked in a sharp breath. Her knees gave out, and if Orion hadn't caught her in time, she would have collapsed onto the floor. "We nearly lost him," the doctor went on, her voice still weary but warm. "The wound was very serious. He lost a great deal of blood, but that dog—" She paused and shook her head with something like admiration. "He wouldn't give up. It was almost as if he knew someone was waiting for him outside." Ren broke down, sobbing, and fell against Orion's shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her and let her cry, one hand moving gently up and down her back. For the first time in his life, he felt that he wanted to protect someone, not out of duty or responsibility, but because he truly cared. They were allowed to see Caesar 10 minutes later. The dog lay on a small bed, bandaged in several places, with an IV line attached to his front leg. He looked smaller now, weaker than the giant guard dog Ren remembered, standing watch over her. But when he saw her walk in, his tail gave a faint wag, and his dark brown eyes opened to look at her with that same unconditional love. Ren dropped to her knees beside the bed, her shaking hand stroking the dog's head. "You idiot," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "My brave, foolish idiot." Caesar gave a soft whine, as if trying to tell her he was all right, that he was still here, that he would never leave her. Ren buried her face in his gray fur, and for the first time in many days, she allowed herself to cry not from pain, but from relief. A week passed. The farm deep in the Cascade Forest slowly began to return to something like normal life, or at least a new version of normal. The broken window frames had been replaced. The overturned furniture and scattered wreckage had been cleared away. The signs of the battle that night were still there, but they were already beginning to fade with time. Caesar lay stretched out on the porch, soaking in the gentle afternoon sunlight of autumn. The dog had been brought back to the farm after 3 days in the hospital, once the veterinarian confirmed he was stable enough to travel. The wound in his shoulder had left behind a large scar, and although new fur had begun to grow in, it couldn't fully hide the mark left by that night. Caesar could no longer run the way he once had. He could no longer launch himself like lightning at the sound of anything suspicious. But none of that stopped him from following Ren everywhere. Wherever she went, he limped after her, slower now, in pain sometimes, but always there, as if he were afraid that if he looked away from her for even a second, she might disappear. Meadow was taken to a psychiatric specialty hospital immediately after the night on the island. 6 years of isolation in that small room had left wounds no one could see, wounds deeper than any scar on the body. In the first days, she said nothing. She only sat on her hospital bed, staring at the white wall as if she were still trapped inside the dark room on Ashford's Island. The doctors said she had severe psychological trauma and would need time and patience to recover. Maybe months, maybe years. Maybe she would never fully become who she had once been. Ren visited every day, never missing a single one. She sat by Meadow's bed without forcing her to talk, without demanding any response. She simply sat there, sometimes reading aloud from an old book, sometimes just sitting in silence and looking out the window. She wanted Meadow to know she was here, that she wasn't going anywhere, that no matter how long it took, she would wait. Then one day, while Ren was sitting there reading from an old book, Meadow moved. Her thin hand reached out, trembling, and closed around her sister's hand. Ren stopped reading, her heart pounding wildly, barely daring to breathe. Meadow looked at her, her eyes still hollow, but something inside them was struggling to rise to the surface. "You," her voice was rough and weak, like dry leaves breaking apart. "You really came," Ren cried, openly, without holding back, without trying to hide it. She gripped her sister's hand tightly and let the tears fall as they wanted. "I always came, Meadow. Always. I never left you." Aldrich was taken to a seaside resort to recover, with Reed guarding him around the clock. The old man's health had stabilized, but the doctors recommended at least 6 months of rest, away from stress and work. Orion ran Steel Holdings from a distance, beginning the long process of turning the empire fully toward legitimate business. His father's final words still echoed in his mind every day. "This network doesn't matter as much as people do." One afternoon, Orion came to visit the farm. He parked outside the gate, stepped out, and saw Ren sitting on the porch with her hands resting on Caesar. The dog lifted his head at the sound of footsteps, his tail giving a faint wag. Ren looked up too, and her amber eyes met his gray ones. Orion climbed the steps and sat down beside her, placing a hand on Caesar's head. "He's doing better," he said. "Slowly, but surely," Ren answered, her voice gentle. "The doctor said the scar will be permanent, but he'll live a normal life. He just won't ever run the same way again." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two people who had walked through hell together and come back, and no longer needed words to fill every space. "Are you staying here?" Orion finally asked. Ren looked out toward the forest ahead, where the afternoon sun was turning the leaves gold. "Meadow needs me. Her recovery is going to take a long time. And Caesar," she looked down at the dog lying quietly at her feet. "He can't travel far. He needs special care." Orion nodded. He understood. "I have to go back to Seattle. There are still too many things to deal with. My father's empire isn't going to clean itself up." Ren turned to look at him. There were 1,000 things unsaid in her eyes, questions left unspoken, answers never offered, but both of them knew. This wasn't the time. Not yet. The final day. Sunset poured over the Cascade Mountains, turning the sky into a painting of orange, pink, and violet. The sun was slowly sinking behind the snow-covered peaks, sending its last rays through the pine branches and scattering them across the porch like strands of gold. The evening wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the scent of the forest Wren had called home for the last 3 years. Orion stood on the porch beside her, and the two of them watched the sun go down in silence, as if they were trying to memorize this moment, memorize this view, memorize the feeling of standing beside each other in the fading light. Caesar lay between them, his head resting on his front paws, his dark brown eyes turned toward the forest. The scar on his shoulder had healed, and new fur was growing in, though it still couldn't fully hide the mark left by that terrible night. The dog breathed steadily, peacefully, as if he knew everything was over now. Orion slipped a hand into the pocket of his coat and took something out, a black leather collar, handmade, strong, crafted from the finest leather money could buy. The clasp was stainless steel, polished until it caught the sunset light, and on the inside was engraved a symbol Wren recognized at once, a lone wolf standing on a mountain peak, looking into the distance. The symbol of the Steele family. Orion knelt beside Caesar, his hand moving gently over the dog's head. "Hey, big guy," he said, his voice soft in the way only those closest to him ever heard. Caesar lifted his head, his dark brown eyes turning to him with a trust the dog rarely gave to anyone. Orion carefully fastened the collar around Caesar's neck, adjusting it so it fit just right, not too tight, not too loose. "Keep it for me," he whispered near the dog's ear. "Keep it until I come back." Caesar looked at him, his tail wagging slowly, as if he understood every word, as if he were accepting this new task, the most important mission he had ever been given. Wren stood still, watching the scene before her. She understood. The collar wasn't a gift for Caesar. It was a promise. It was the invisible thread that tied him to this place, to her. It was his way of saying he would come back without having to say the words aloud. "You don't have to," she began, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. Orion rose and turned to look at her. His gray eyes in the sunset seemed warmer now, softer than they had the first time they met. "I want to," he answered simply. No explanation, no justification, just the truth. Silence stretched between them. Orion looked toward the mountains, where the sun had nearly disappeared altogether. "You need time," he said, "with Meadow, with helping her heal, with yourself." Wren nodded. "And you need to rebuild everything. Your family's empire, a new path." "I do." Neither of them wanted to say goodbye, because goodbye would have meant admitting they were parting, and neither of them was ready for that. Orion stepped closer to Wren and stood in front of her. He didn't kiss her. They weren't there yet. Their lives were too complicated, too full of things that still needed to be repaired before they could think about anything else. But he lifted his hand and laid it gently against her cheek, his fingers warm against skin cooled by the evening air. Wren didn't pull away. She stood still and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his hand. "Seattle is beautiful in the spring," Orion whispered, his voice light as the wind. "Cherry blossoms bloom everywhere, along the lake, in the parks, on the quiet streets." Wren opened her eyes and looked at him. She understood. That wasn't a description of the city. It was an invitation, a question, a hope. "Maybe I'll come see it," she answered, her voice catching. "When spring comes." Orion smiled, a small smile but a real one. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back. "I'll see you again, Wren." He turned and walked toward the black car waiting at the end of the dirt road. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because this wasn't goodbye. It was only for now. Caesar got to his feet, his tail wagging, his dark brown eyes following the car as it slowly rolled away. The black leather collar around his neck caught the last of the sunset light, the wolf symbol standing out against the leather. Wren stood on the porch and watched the car disappear beyond the line of pines. She rested her hand on Caesar's head, her fingers sliding down to the collar, touching the wolf symbol pressed deep into the leather. "He'll come back," she whispered, not knowing whether she was speaking to Caesar or to herself. "Won't he, Caesar?" The dog looked at her, his dark brown eyes deep and knowing, as if he already knew the answer, as if he had seen the future, and he was waiting. Spring came to the farm deep in the Cascade Forest, like a promise faithfully kept. Wildflowers bloomed everywhere, spreading blankets of purple, yellow, and white across the small field in front of the house. The trees had turned lush again after a long winter, tender new leaves reaching for the warm sunlight of those early April days. The air was full of the scent of fresh earth, of new blossoms, of life returning. Meadow was gardening beside her sister, her hands carefully placing young seedlings into rows of freshly turned soil. 6 months of treatment had brought small but meaningful changes. She still spoke very little, still startled when unexpected sounds broke the quiet, still sometimes stared into the distance with that faraway look in her eyes. But there had been moments when she smiled. There had been afternoons when she sat in the grass and let butterflies rest against her fingers. And her eyes, though they hadn't yet regained the full brightness they had before everything happened, had begun to hold life again. The doctors said gardening was good therapy. It helped Meadow reconnect with the outside world, with nature, with the ordinary life that had been stolen from her for 6 long years. Caesar lay in the sun on the grass near the two sisters, his dark brown eyes half closed as he enjoyed the warmth of spring. The scar on his shoulder showed clearly in the sunlight, the fur never growing back fully there, leaving a permanent mark. But to Wren, that scar wasn't a flaw, it was a medal, proof of courage and unconditional loyalty. Wren stood up and went inside to get water for both of them. On the table, the morning newspaper was still open to the page she had been reading over breakfast. The headline was large and impossible to miss. Conrad Ashford sentenced to 35 years in prison. International money laundering network completely dismantled. She looked at the photograph of Ashford being led into court in handcuffs. The face that had once been polished and confident, now twisted with bitterness. She set the paper down and smiled faintly. That chapter was over. Completely. Late in the afternoon, Wren sat on the porch with one hand resting on Caesar's head, her eyes on Meadow, who was sitting in the grass while a yellow butterfly perched on her finger. The phone in Wren's pocket vibrated, something she had started using again after years of cutting herself off from the world. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. A message. A familiar number. No name, but she knew exactly who it was. Seattle is beautiful in the spring. Does Caesar like cherry blossoms? Wren smiled. A real smile. The first one that reached her eyes since the day he had left 6 months earlier. She looked at Meadow, her sister who had come so far and could now be on her own for a few days if needed. She looked at Caesar, whose tail was wagging as if he somehow knew who had sent the message. She looked at the black leather collar around his neck, the wolf symbol gleaming in the late afternoon light. She typed back, "Maybe it's time for us to come and see." Send. She lifted her face to the clear blue sky of spring and drew in a deep breath filled with the scent of flowers and hope. Caesar rested his head on her lap and closed his eyes, peaceful, as if the dog knew a new journey was about to begin. And he was ready. There are meetings that change a life. There are doors that open and lead to roads no one expected. And there are promises that don't need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes all it takes is a black leather collar, a wolf's mark, and the faith that spring will come. Orion Steele was still waiting. Wren Calloway was ready, and Caesar, the dog who had nearly given his life to protect the people he loved, would remain beside them no matter where the next journey led. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that sometimes opening the door for the right person can change everything. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories. And please leave a comment below telling us which moment in this story made it impossible for you to look away. We'd truly love to hear what you felt in the deepest part of your heart. Remember that no matter how thick the darkness may be, there is always someone willing to open the door when you knock. And there are always loyal hearts that never abandon the ones they love. As Caesar proved, loyalty doesn't need words, it only needs action. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.